We just heard a moment ago Vietnam's president delivering the keynote at this year's Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore. He outlined what he said is a world confronted with multiple risks and uncertainty, more connected yet more vulnerable. And he framed that uncertainty and risk by a convergence of three, what he called foundational crises: in the international order, in development models, and in the lack of strategic trust. Mr. To Lam referring again and again to the need for a rules-based, law-based order. Dr. Vu joins us right now. He's a visiting scholar for the Political Science Department at Boston College. Dr. Vu, what stood out for you in this speech? 19 minutes of speech.
So what I understood from President and General Secretary To Lam's speech is that this is Vietnam understanding of the regional order. And the speech is drawn upon Vietnam experience with navigating the geopolitical front line and how to devise a foreign policy to maintain economic development. So President To Lam's speech is built upon Vietnam 4-No principle, which is no alliance, no siding with one country against the other, no foreign military bases on Vietnamese soil or using the territory of one member against the other member of the international community. And finally, no use of force or threat of use of force in international relations. So President To Lam said explicitly in his speech that the region should not be dominated by any powers and that ASEAN members and the member of the international community should adhere to the rules of law and to make sure that there should not be any kind of arms race so that the region can be free of a great power rivalry and so that the region can maintain its economic growth and political stability.
These 4 no's that Vietnam has, in fact, is the backbone of its foreign policy from the 1990s onwards. I think the final edition was in the 2010s. Are there suggestions that now, and I'll ask you why, the world order as we know it is no longer quite so easily managed by this framework of Vietnam's 4 no's?
So Vietnam understanding of its 4 no's is that this is Vietnam's way to hedge among the great powers. So Vietnam devised this 4-No foreign policy at a time when it was allied with the Soviet Union, but the Soviet Union was on the decline. So Vietnam at that time was internationally isolated by the United States and China, as well as by ASEAN and the United Nations. So the idea for Vietnam when coming up with the 4 no's here is that Vietnam should not be allied with any other great power, so that Vietnam will no longer be a great power battlefield like it was during the 3 Indochina Wars.
If I could just,
I think that what President To Lam...
pardon me. So Vietnam has done this proficiently for years, decades, in fact, balancing between two, at least two in one instance, and then a changing of superpowers to superpowers. But why is it now that hedging is proving even more difficult?
So I think that the idea behind Vietnam's strategy for hedging here is that as the great powers rivalry become more intense, it is more important for Vietnam and the member of ASEAN and as well as other middle powers to stay neutral. Because the moment that one member become allied with a great power, then the region can be polarized. And as Vietnam understood from its lesson from the 3rd Indochina War here is that it wants to be neutral in the Sino-Soviet conflict. But the moment that the Chinese or the Soviet Union demanded Vietnam to be on their side, which Vietnam later became a Soviet ally, then the region was deeply, deeply polarized, as we saw from the 3rd Indochina War when Vietnam fought against China and the Khmer Rouge, and the rest of ASEAN stood up against Vietnam. And Vietnam did not want that to happen. And it think that it's a lesson that members of ASEAN right now should understand, because that is a lesson that Vietnam take away from the Thailand-Cambodia conflict, is that the moment that one country no longer adhere to ASEAN centrality, seeking help from a great power from outside of the region, then other countries in ASEAN may decide that it's best for their own security to ally with another great power to oppose the other country effort to balance against that alliance So I think this is an arms race, not only about guns and weapons. It's also about an arms race in diplomacy. Is that the moment that one country decided to side with either the United States or China, then other country may follow suit, and the region will become fractured and polarized. And this is what President To Lam is suggesting, that we should not be going down the path of.
But Dr. Vu, in principle, that should be the case. But we look at this particular Thailand, Cambodia, that fracas between the two. So one side was very prepared to be bilateral. The other one was consistently calling for an internationalization of the crisis, looking to the US, looking to China, the other side saying we need to sort it out just between the two of us. So Vietnam saying ASEAN centrality, we all need to stay neutral. Or neither Thailand nor Cambodia was listening at that point. What's the guarantee that anyone would ever listen to that in the future?
I think that this again boils down to Vietnam's proactive diplomacy role. So before President To Lam went to Singapore, he actually is on a tour to Thailand, to Singapore, and to the Philippines. And Vietnam also had a really close relationship with Cambodia. So Vietnam's foreign vision is not just talk. So Vietnam is actively trying to maintain its relation and manage relation between its ASEAN peers. So when it comes to the Thailand-Cambodia conflict, Vietnam is saying that it doesn't support either side explicitly, but what it supports here is that it supports a peaceful end to the conflict. So with Cambodia, Vietnam consistently tells the Cambodian government not to use force and to adhere to ASEAN centrality. And when it comes to Thailand, President To Lam just went to Thailand, and in that visit, then President To Lam explicitly told the Thai government that Vietnam also want Thailand to adhere to ASEAN centrality, and Vietnam doesn't support any kind of conflict between ASEAN's members. And throughout the entire region as a whole, then President To Lam is trying to show that Vietnam is ready to become a mediator, and also trying to make sure that its peers members' interests are honored. This is also, again, a lesson that Vietnam learned from hosting the 2019 Trump-Kim summit in Hanoi, which is a case that Vietnam is showing it can become a mediator to any kind of conflict in the region. So President To Lam is backing up his foreknowledge, his vision for Southeast Asia with Vietnam proactive diplomacy.
All right, Dr. Vu, To Lam, for me, some standout points referring to small countries increasingly vulnerable to coercion in the economic, technological, financial, and security domains. Small countries, states, particularly small and medium-sized ones, are facing mounting pressure to have to choose sides. Vietnam, that could be one reason why it is the president's delivering the keynote at this Shangri-La Dialogue, because it's small to medium. It is a potential powerhouse, certainly in Southeast Asia. Is the solution in sorry, please continue.
Sorry. So I think that the President To Lam's presence at Shangri-La Dialogue this year sent a really strong message that as the world is becoming more fractured, then middle power has a role to play. So right now, when we look at countries like Vietnam was, again, outside of the ASEAN order, and now it's becoming a champion of that order. So what Vietnam is trying to suggest to the big powers, Russia, China, the United States, is that the middle powers also have a voice and have a role to play. So for Vietnam, obviously, it cannot arms race. It cannot fight against the great powers on its own. It's also a victim of great power rivalry. But what President To Lam is saying at Shangri-La and with his Southeast Asia tour is that middle powers, if they adhere to the same ASEAN centrality order and to international law, then these middle powers, they can actually secure and maintain regional order so long as they are not being coerced, they are not being polarized by any great power interference. That is the message that President To Lam wanted to send, because Vietnam lesson from the third Indochina War and the previous two Indochina Wars is that the moment that it is to side with a great power, then war was almost inevitable. So what President To Lam is trying to say here is that so long as the middle powers are neutral, not aligned, and they can maintain some degree of independence from the great powers, then the region can become peaceful and stable.
A final question, Dr. Vu. A lot is made of President To Lam being possibly the most powerful, at least in terms of the titles he holds, a leader in Vietnam in decades. He will be able to stay in office. He has been able to push through his many initiatives fairly coherently and consistently in the last 1-2 years, certainly. Vietnam would be one example of a country that is able to make economic security translate into defense security, which was a point that he was making. Defense alone is not what a country needs for sustained security. Final question on that.
Yeah, so I think that President To Lam is suggesting here is that the world order has changed. It's no longer just about guns and weapons. It's now about economic interconnectedness. So one thing I really find remarkable about President To Lam's speech is that he said economic security is also national security. And like you say, then if a country can become economically secure, and if the region can be free from an arms race, then ASEAN and the international order as a whole can be preserved. So what I think that President To Lam wants to send a message here is that Vietnam can be a model that other ASEAN members or other middle powers can emulate. First, you need to be economically stable so that you can maintain your internal order. So Vietnam has been really good at maintaining an impressive domestic economic growth rate. And Vietnam has been in the middle of a really huge infrastructure redevelopment at this point. So President To Lam has been really ambitious about turning Vietnam into a high-tech, a manufacturer of the world. And Vietnam is really trying to become one of the leaders in AI revolution. And translating that kind of economic development power into foreign policy, what President To Lam is trying to say here is that so long as Vietnam can maintain a stable economic order and stable political order, then it can leverage its position to win trade deals, to leverage its relationship with one big power to negotiate with another power. So that's why Vietnam, even though it was slapped a really high rate of tariffs by the United States, but its export to the US is growing, and its relationship with China are still really amicable. So what President To Lam is trying to say here is that countries in the region like Thailand, Singapore, the Philippines, Indonesia, and Malaysia, they can also be adopting Vietnamese model of balancing economic growth internally with a foreign policy of non-alignment externally. The final goal here is that not just Vietnam is getting rich, but Southeast Asia as a whole can get rich. And if the region can get rich, then the possibility of war will decline, and the region as a whole can at least maintain an ASEAN centrality order and avoid being fractured by the use of force by any great powers. So President To Lam didn't mention any power specifically, but he just wanted to say that ASEAN as a whole should be free from coercion and domination by any single powers.
Thanks. Dr. Khang Vu, visiting scholar for the Political Science Department at Boston College.